Hi everyone, it's Jaime Alejandro and this is the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I showcase hardworking, independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. I have a great conversation lined up for you today, but before I get to it, I just want to give you a quick reminder. Cruise Notes 2.0, my newsletter, is coming out once again today, the 10th. It is a Friday. So head on over to cruisefolio.com/cruisenotes to get the monthly email. That's right, one email a month that will include notes and impressions from all of these Arts Calling episodes. I'm going back to the old archives of the podcast, going through each episode and making specific highlights and impressions of the things that I'm learning along the way from all these episodes, as well as writings from yours truly over at cruisefolio.com. and projects over at the Coalition. So it's a little bit of a mixed bag, but it is a reflection of the guy running the ship aground, and that is yours truly. So I hope that you come along and join me on this project. I think it'll be a fun time. All right, folks, with that out of my system, I'd like to introduce you to today's guest. I'm delighted to be Arts Calling this week, author Paul Cody. Let me tell you about Paul. Paul Cody's published novels include Shooting the Heart, Love is Both Wave and Particle, Sphyxia, as well as a memoir, The Last Next Time. His work has appeared in various periodicals, including Harper's, Epoch, The Quarterly, Story, and elsewhere. He lives with his wife in Ithaca, New York. Now, folks, you're in for a wonderful time. Paul and I had a great conversation here. We discuss, of course, his latest novel, Walk the Dark, which is coming out at the end of this month from Regal House Publishing, which is a dark and gritty but ultimately tender novel about finding hope in the darkest of times. I think there's such redeeming beauty in the dark world that he's creating, but it is the world that we live in. It is a very real world, and I deeply appreciated Paul taking the time to share his insights with us, as well as opening up about his own journey. And we discuss a lot. I gotta say, this was a really expansive conversation, but I hope you stick around and enjoy it because we had a wonderful time. So without further delay, let's give Paul a call. Okay, thank you so much, Paul, for taking the time to join me today. How are you over there in your neck of the woods?
I'm doing fine. We're enjoying sunny weather, which is unusual for upstate New York. And other than that, spring is not too far away, we hope and think. So all is well here.
Wonderful to hear. So I'm really excited to get to talk to you about your latest work, Walk the Dark. But before we get to it, I'd like to check in a little bit with you and see if we could start at the beginning, maybe go back to the first times that you were discovering creativity. Do you remember what that was?
It's hard to say when exactly, although I do remember vividly as a very young kid really loving books. I liked the look of them. I liked the way they felt. I liked the way they smelled even. And my parents were real big on reading. We didn't have a television set and we didn't have a car, but we had a lot of books. And I just fell in love with books very, very early. And as I was growing up, both my parents were readers, and my mother would occasionally slip me books and say, well, this might be a little bit old for you, maybe for an older kid, but I think you should try to read it. And of course, I think she was being a little subtle and sly by getting me to read books, but a couple I remember in particular. One was Man-Child in the Promised Land by Claude Brown, about a kid growing up. It's a nonfiction book about a kid growing up in Harlem and dealing with, gunfire and heroin and poverty and racism. And it was just really powerful and eye-opening for me. I might have been, 10, 11 years old. And one other book she gave me was A Choice of Weapons by Gordon Parks, who at the time was a great photographer at Life magazine. and he went on to direct Shaft as well as some
Oh,
other movies. But his book was about, I believe he was the youngest of 15 kids growing up in the rural South. I don't know if it was Mississippi or Alabama or Georgia, but it was really extraordinary. And it was about his choice of how to deal with poverty and racism. And he chose art, he chose photography, he chose books, he chose movies. And I remember both those books having an enormous impact on me at a quite young age. Maybe I was 10, 11, 12, somewhere
right.
around there. But my mom was very attuned to that kind of stuff, and she got me going and kept me going.
Right. And it seems that you yourself had an opportunity to make that choice yourself. There may have been some dark times during your life, and eventually you made your way back to art, to creativity, to that kind of expression. Could you set the stage a little bit as to what happened in your earlier years that you felt you had to overcome? There were some experiences that you mentioned that sort of set the stage for you to have to battle and return to a healthier version of yourself.
Well, originally, when I was probably 13 or 14 when I first discovered alcohol and drugs, and this was in the 60s, late 60s, so it was very prevalent. It was easy to get a hold of alcohol and drugs. And I grew up in a fairly affluent suburb, but even though my family came from like the least affluent, most working class part of the city. And I had also something that I had experienced much earlier when I was 7 or 8. I was sexually abused by a neighbor kid. And I buried that so deep that I didn't even remember to recall it until 30 or 40 years later when a psychiatrist was doing this battery of tests.
Wow.
And it showed up everywhere, like in the ink blot tests and the Minnesota multiphasic tests. He tested me about 4 or 5 hours, and then he said, "You were sexually abused." And I said, No, I wasn't. And he said, "Look at your answer to this, look at your answer to this, look at," and everything about it was about sexual violation. And I said to him, "Wait a minute, maybe there was this thing with a neighbor kid who was 4 or 5 years older than me. I was maybe 7 or 8. And essentially he raped me. And it happened 3 or 4 times. And then I just sort of ran away from it. And never told anybody until I was in my 40s and very depressed and in a local psychiatric unit. And suddenly I discovered it, and it like explains so many things. And I thought also, he said, "What do you write? What are your books about?" And I said, "Well, my first book is called The Stolen Child, and it's about a boy who gets abducted by a pedophile." And it was like, duh, how could I not have seen that? How could I not have connected those things? And yet I had buried it so deeply, the only way it could come out in a way was unconsciously through my writing.
That's an incredible realization, and it's one of those things that I imagine informed a lot of your actions earlier on. But maybe it felt like you were operating from a place of not knowing, a place of desperation that you couldn't name, and so that led you down a darker path for a time. Is that correct? With
Yeah, I
the
mean,
drinking.
basically from, I would say, 13, 14, 15, I discovered alcohol and drugs, and very quickly, I'd say by the age of 16, I was a full-blown alcoholic and drug addict. And it was mostly prescription drugs that I could get my hands on and beer and wine and various things. But I just really got lost pretty badly in alcohol and drug addiction. I barely graduated from high school. I think I graduated in the bottom 10% of my high school class. and had to spend an extra year to even graduate. And then I more or less spent 5 or 6 years just absolutely lost in this haze of booze and drugs. I worked here and there as a house painter. I did various labor jobs to make money, all of which I spent on alcohol and drugs. And at a certain point when I think I was 22, I was brought to a local emergency room at a hospital. And at the emergency room, I very stupidly punched a doctor. And it wasn't much of a punch because I was a scrawny little kid who I probably weighed 130 pounds. But because of that, it's not a good idea to punch doctors in emergency rooms. And they got a pink paper, a 30-day commitment to a state mental hospital, which was a locked ward. And later, much later, it was used as the backdrop for the movie Shutter Island. All those exterior shots were taken at Medfield State Hospital in Massachusetts, which is this place I had been.
Yeah. So what was your relationship with family at the time, given these struggles? Were they by your side? Did you have distance from your family? What was that like?
I think it was kind of mixed. I always knew and felt like my family loved me, and they did the best they could for me, and my parents were together, and they were very good, decent people. But people, they didn't know what to make of this, just as I didn't know what to make of it. I mean, I thought I was crazy. I thought I was, somehow doomed to this terrible life of, alcoholism and drug addiction. And I remember sort of coming to in the state hospital and saying to myself, oh, so this is where we are. This is where this has brought me to. And I remember, too, a nurse said to me at Medfield the day I got there, if you hit anybody here, you're going to Bridgewater. And Bridgewater was locally famous in Massachusetts as the state hospital for the criminally insane. In fact, Albert DeSalvo, the Boston Strangler, had gone to Bridgewater, and whenever some person committed some insane crime, they were always sent to Bridgewater. And that really got my attention. I thought, oh my God, not that, please, no. And bit by bit, I sort of came to, and I thought, I got to do something about this. I'm better than this. This is going to end very badly, and this is a terrible place to be when you're 22, 23 years old. And so after I was released from the hospital, I lived at my parents' house, and God bless them, they took me in after all this, just crazy behavior for years. And I went to college when I believe I was 24, and I started going to AA, and I got straight and sober, and my life changed hugely, dramatically. It went from this really dark, awful, suicidal behavior in place. And suddenly I could go to college, and I loved it because I had always been a reader. I had read a ton of books, and I was an English major, and I suddenly, it was like going from night to day. It's like someone flipped the lights on, and I could read and write and get patted on the back for it. And it gave me direction, it gave me structure. And the whole act of reading and writing for me was always enormous. And I swear, without books, without the ability to read and write, I wouldn't be here. I would be a dead man. I'm sure of that. And for me, it was almost like a religion that saved my life.
Mm. Was there religion around the family, or something that you felt was an anchor at some point in time in your life, like perhaps you had replaced your, perhaps if there was an affinity for religion, replace that with books?
Well, it was interesting because my parents are both very serious Catholics, and both of them had been involved in the Catholic worker movement in the late 1940s and early 1950s. And that was this really left-leaning place. They called themselves Fools for Christ.
Mm.
And they set up houses of hospitality in the inner city. And they started out in the Bowery, and this woman named Dorothy Day, who later became very famous, started this with a guy named Peter Morin, and it spread, and it's still going today, and they still have houses of hospitality, and they take in anybody and everybody. And so my parents always had this very powerful sense of social justice that, you really had to do something good. It wasn't about money. It wasn't about materialism. It was about social justice and fairness and, a real basic Christianity that wasn't the usual oppressive, don't do this, don't do that. It's like, what can you do for those who are less fortunate than you?
Yeah.
And so I always had that.
I appreciate you sharing that because it makes me feel like it might have been counter to what popular opinion might have been at that time. It just strikes me, and perhaps I'm not too well versed in the social history of the time, but it seems like back in those days, folks were more likely to turn a blind eye to the things that weren't that looked unseemly, that might have maybe tainted a perspective. And so I guess I was mostly curious about what that social expectation was for your family, if you felt like you had to maintain some kind of standard of what the family was supposed to be. But it seems like your parents were pretty open at that time period, which strikes me as a surprise.
Yeah, they were pretty different in a lot of ways because the city, Newton, is, a lot of people had a lot of money, and we didn't have a car, we didn't have a TV, we had food to eat, and both my parents worked a lot. And they always told us, and sort of, by example, they worked, they tried to do the right things. I remember each year for Christmas or Thanksgiving, my parents would invite guys who had been conscientious objectors against the war in Vietnam, and they would have these guys over to our house for dinner for Thanksgiving and Christmas. And it really, it was like my parents, without preaching to us or trying to, bang these ideals into our head, exposed us to stuff that was really different. My parents admired somebody who would have the courage to say, I'm not going to fight in the war. I don't believe in war. I don't believe in killing. And these guys instead were serving in hospitals and places like that, and food kitchens, and doing alternative service. And that was very much in the air in my family, and in this whole crazy milieu of the late 60s and 70s, when it seemed like the world was exploding, and these horrible assassinations in the war in Vietnam and civil rights were really burning hot. And so it was something I was very much aware of from an early age. And I guess at certain times I lost touch with it because of my alcoholism and drug addiction, but it was something that was always there. And I was always aware of it, that you should try to practice kindness. You should try to practice charity. I mean, not in the faith, hope, charity in that sense, that you should try to do good in the world and make the world a little kinder, a little more gentle, a little more tolerant. And those are really big things to me
Yeah.
when I was young. And I guess I carried it through even, once I was getting straight and sober and going to school.
Yeah, and it is definitely a commendable thing. And I have a question about the second chapter of your life here, because as you become sober and you start getting back on your feet, you begin this trajectory to become an educator, if I'm not mistaken. So I'd like you to maybe talk a
Yeah.
little bit about that and how you made your way into serving a lot of underserved communities with art, with literature. Maybe you can elaborate a little bit, and then we'll get to talking about your writing, because I think that's going to be a good segue.
Yeah, that's good and that's interesting. It was interesting when I finished college, and I had, after being a D-minus student in high school, I graduated with high honors in English and various departmental prizes. And I was thinking that I would go to graduate school eventually, but first I wanted to work, and to work for a few years. And I spent 3 years working at the Perkins School for the Blind, which is right outside Boston. And it's a very old school of its. I think it might be the oldest of its kind in the country, but it's where Helen Keller and Anne Sullivan had met. Or the director of Perkins sent Anne Sullivan to Alabama, I believe, to work with Helen Keller. And I worked there for 3 years, and I didn't make a lot of money, but I loved the work. And the kids I worked with were mostly teenagers. They were legally blind, and they were developmentally disabled. And on top of that, a lot of them had pretty serious social problems with, if you don't have language, you respond to frustration with violence. And so these kids would often lash out. They would act out their frustrations, and their frustrations were quite real. And our whole job at Perkins was to try to replace bad behavior or, destructive behavior with language. It was like saying to a little kid, use your words. Don't hit someone over the head with a pail in the sandbox. Use your words. Express what's inside of you and what you need and what you're unhappy about. And so it seemed to me a real corollary of instead of using alcohol and drugs to deaden my senses, I use language to try to acknowledge and come to terms with the things inside me, not just my own dark history, but with depression and anxiety and all that stuff. And it seemed like the more language I had and the way I was able to use language on the page in a short story or an essay or a novel, the better off I was. And it was like, as Gordon Parks, the great photographer and director, it was a choice of weapons. What tools are you going to use to get through the world and to communicate what's inside of you to other people and to the world in general? And I think it was just being able to articulate that and to come to terms with it in this real basic way. Because a lot of these kids I was working with, they might have been 15, 16. They had the bodies of adults, but they were, at a sort of intellectual age of, 5 or 6 or 7. And they hadn't had much language. And so we would teach them sign language, and we would teach them to sign certain things. Like if they were sitting there and they were really hungry or needed to go to the bathroom or didn't feel good, instead of knocking over a chair or a bookcase to get people's attention, they could tap you on the shoulder and sign, I need the bathroom, or I need something to eat, or my head hurts. And if they were able to do that, they could have a much more constructive way in the world and in a given situation because they could articulate it. And that was sort of on a very basic level, but it sort of started with that and went all the way up to, writing literary novels later as I grew older and as I read more and more and more and read really good, challenging novels and plays and poems. So there was a really deep, profound sense that the ability to have a voice, to be able to give voice to what's inside you, was enormously important. You couldn't underestimate how important it was. And so when I started teaching, in fact, I sort of started teaching with young people who were severely disabled. And in some ways, it wasn't that different from when I went to college. I was a tutor in the English department, a writing tutor. And then eventually, when I went to graduate school, I was actually teaching in the classroom. I'd have my own students. And I would often talk to them that say, well, I can't write. I've always, some teacher's been beating me over the head with a grammar book. And and they'd say, I can't write. And I'd say, yes, you can. If you can speak, you can write. You just got to get it onto the page.
Right.
And I'd try to just I'd say, listen, you're stepping on your own story. You're getting in your own way. You need to give yourself a license to write, to express yourself, to see that your story, no matter what it is incredibly valuable. And the world needs to hear it, and you need to express it. And once I was able to put it in those terms and kind of talk the students into believing that they had important things to say. And sometimes they'd say to me, well, nothing's ever happened to me. And I said, well, have you ever loved anybody? Have you ever been hurt by somebody? Have you ever been betrayed? Have you ever been afraid? Have you ever, there's so many experiences. All of us as human beings, we all go through it. We all feel hurt, feel wounded, feel happy, feel all kinds of things. And the question then is to say, okay, well, your story, you are interesting. Right. And just by asking questions of my students, like, tell me about your mom and dad. Did you have a happy childhood? If so, how come? Or what was the best moment or the worst moment? And once I was able to convince them that what they had to say was valuable, it seems like everything else fell into place.
Oh, it's amazing.
And it was just a matter of saying to them, listen, you matter. Your voice matters. Your story matters. Your life matters. And you have to really begin to believe that. And I'd say, even if you don't believe it, fake it till you make it, as they used to say in AA. And just trust me on this. Just do it. And they usually did. And they were usually kind of amazed at themselves. And for me, it was just enormously moving and gratifying to sort of help them find their own voice.
That's
and
wonderful
that
to hear.
To me, it was just, for me, it was just, that's what teaching is about.
That's just an incredible sentiment to pass on to future generations of creative folks and storytellers, that they have a possibility to share their own story and contribute in that way. But let's talk about your latest work. And I'd like you to tell me a bit about the protagonist. We have Oliver Curtin, who is carrying a burden for something that he committed when he was a young man. And so I'd like you to tell me a little bit more about this story, Walk the Dark. Set the stage for me on what we have to look forward to.
Well, it's a novel about a guy who is in his late 40s, and he grew up with his mom was a sex worker, and she had Oliver, the boy, when she was like 16 years old, and never knew who the father was. They lived very much on the edge of, poverty, of degradation, of selling, being forced to sell your body to make a living. And so they were bouncing around from, house to house or apartment to apartment. And the mother became a serious alcoholic and drug user. And she loves her son, Oliver, but she's really unreliable. She becomes different people at different times when she's drunk or she's using heroin or crack or cocaine or whatever. She is a different person, even though she loves her son and he knows it, but she's completely unreliable. So he basically grows up in this really, really difficult, almost loveless environment where different men would come in and out of the life, the apartment, and he basically became kind of invisible. But he also started using alcohol and drugs very early, probably when he was 8 or 9. And he didn't go to school. His mother somehow filled out papers that she would educate him. So he grows up basically in this intense isolation. And in the present of the novel, he's in a maximum security prison, finishing the last part of a 25 years to life sentence for a crime he committed at 17. He committed murder when he was 17 years old. And it almost was an inadvertent murder. He didn't set out to kill anybody, but he started breaking into houses, not so much to get things and not so much to claim booty and get money and stuff like that, but it's like he's intensely curious to know what a normal life is. Like people who live 2 or 3 streets over, who lived in nice houses. It's like he needed to know what was their life like, and what he tried to imagine that. And then he would actually go into the houses. And so as he's nearing the end of his 25-year sentence, he's trying to remember where he was, how he got there, what happened to his mother, what happened to the few people he did know. And the more truthful he can be, the more brave he can be about being honest about what he did and what he didn't do and how he became kind of this lonely, profoundly lonely, isolated kid. He's trying to understand why that happened and how it happened and how his mother, when he was like 15 or 16, she just disappeared. I mean, she just was gone, and he never really knew why. But it's like until he can understand and come to terms with his history and his childhood and his early years, he can't, in a way, find redemption. He can't basically clear his conscience and become a full human being until he really engages with remembering and almost reliving his past.
Right.
So there's two narratives, the one in the present in this maximum security prison, which is Auburn Prison, where I taught for 2 years while I was teaching college. It's the life he lives day to day in the maximum security prison, but it's also the life that he's remembering from this far back as, when he was 3 or 4 or 5 years old. And the two move forward in kind of concert with each other. And if he's able to come to terms honestly and deeply and in a fully engaged way with what happened to him and why it happened,
Uh-huh.
then he, in a way, won't be ready to go into the world. And that even if he does get parole, and there's every reason to think he will get parole, what is life going to be like out there? I mean, he's never basically been in the world except for, this very narrow, limited, almost claustrophobic world that he lived in with his mother, to this really claustrophobic world in a maximum security prison. And so the two go together, and it's a way for him to try to come to terms with what happened and how he can kind of make amends for it, or how he can redeem himself. And in a way, it goes back to that thing I mentioned earlier, that if you're able to articulate where you were, where you came from, what happened to you, if you realize that your life is worth remembering and writing about, then maybe you can be in the world. Maybe you can be fully human again. Maybe you can reclaim your humanity and your place in the world, in the larger world.
Wonderful. So I'd like to ask you something in terms of a technical concern here of constructing this story, because the way you describe it, it does sound like a very emphatic take on the prisoner experience. It does sound like you've put a lot of consideration into humanizing and making sure that these people in the story are well conceived. But my question to you is, how do you go about reconciling what some might consider the more sensational or lurid passages of the story that are obviously inherent to the character, and how do you try to manage that balance of making sure that this story is presented in a way that is not gratuitous, but rather informing the choices that this character is making throughout the journey?
That's a great question, and it's something that's always preoccupied me throughout my writing. I very often write about people who are on the margins of society, alcoholics and drug addicts, and people who are, labeled crazy. Because I spent time on psychiatric wards, and I taught for 2 years in a maximum security prison. And one of the reasons I did that was partly my life was so good. I was at college, I was teaching college. I had 2 kids. I had published books. I had enough money. Things had really worked out well for me, and I thought I should give back. I thought it would be good for me and my soul to go into a maximum security prison where the people, in a way, there's no lower people in our society. They're about as bad as it gets, and people want to lock them up and throw away the key. And I always thought people ended up in prison for really, if you put yourself in their shoes and what they went through and how they grew up, which was radically different from how I grew up, without parents, without any sense of books or learning or any possibility to participate fully in our society. And I always thought, it wasn't as though someone said to them when they were 15 years old, okay, kid, you can either go to Harvard or you can go to Auburn Prison. Which do you choose? I mean, it doesn't happen like that. And what always struck me is that the people I was teaching in prison, nearly all of them were there for violent crimes, for sexual assault, for murder, for manslaughter, for armed robbery, for, all kinds of really serious crimes. And they were in there for long, long sentences. Some of them had 50-year to life sentences. Some of them had 25 to life. If I saw someone who had less than 15 years, a 15-year sentence, that was rare. And yet I went in there partly to honor my parents and to remind myself of where I so easily could have gone if I had kept drinking and doing drugs. And it always struck me that these are still human beings. We may lock them up and we may throw out the key and we might say, I have no sympathy for you. You made choices and now you commit the crime, you do the time, as they would say in prison. But I also thought these people were still human beings. And the people I tended to teach who came to the classes we taught at night, one night a week, were people who had been in the prison for 10 or 15 years. They had settled down. They were more or less trying to make the best of the situation. And there's very little offered to them in terms of rehabilitation, very few opportunities at education or learning a trade or anything. I mean, we were in these very draconian years of, 3 strikes and you're out. Let's fry people. Everybody's a Ted Bundy. Let's kill them. And I just found that way too simple and way too easy. And I was much, much more interested in how does this happen? How does somebody, by intentionally or unintentionally, how do they end up in prison? What are they like? Did they have a mother or a father? Did they have a grandmother or an aunt? Did anybody ever care about them? Did any of them ever have the least chance? Did anybody, you go in and these are guys that sometimes be missing half an ear or that have incredible scars across their face or on their arms. They were covered by tattoos. Some of them were pretty scary looking. And I'm a fairly big guy and I don't scare that easily. But when I first went in, I thought, oh my God, this is a whole different world. This is like nowhere I've ever been and nowhere I ever want to go, except as maybe a teacher who could go in and come out 2 hours later having taught. But I remember thinking, my God, they withstand this extraordinary existence under maximum control. Mm-hmm. And how do they hang on to their humanity? And do they hang on to their humanity? And my sense was that these were people who really deeply wanted to find some redemption. And they wanted to find a way that they might eventually be back out in the world and have a chance at a decent life, a life with some dignity, a life with some hope, with the possibility of love. And I always disliked people saying, oh, so-and-so is this color or this ethnicity or has done this or that thing, has stolen something, has sexually assaulted somebody, therefore we can sum them up in a couple of words and lock them away and forget about them. And that went against everything I believed in and everything I knew. And it was also the opposite of what good literature teaches us, which is that people are complex. People have really different stories, and that we can have no idea whatsoever. They may seem perfectly normal, and it's like, oh yeah, we're all the same. We all share the same experience. And my experience is that doesn't happen at all. It's like people, you can have no idea whatsoever what they've gone through and what they've suffered. And it got to the point where it was like, I would hear some of these guys' stories about their childhood and their adolescence. And I'd say to myself, how could they not have ended up in prison? I mean, they had no chance whatsoever. And so that always fascinated me. And it was like my own dark, self-destructive urges of, I'd deal with depression, I dealt with alcoholism and drug addiction. And I came very, very close at times. I could so easily have been busted and sent to prison. And I was a fairly articulate white guy growing up in a pretty nice suburb where, people weren't shooting people. People weren't hustling in the streets. People weren't, having knife fights or gunfights. People weren't worried about, living out in the streets and getting robbed and getting subjected to incredible violence and violation and all that stuff. And so it became for me this idea of finding their humanity and tapping into their humanity and using literature and poetry and saying, okay, let's sit down and we're gonna look at these things. We're gonna read stuff together. And I'm going to try to show you guys some of what can be found in literature. And someone famously said, nobody dies for lack of a poem, but every day people die from lack of what is to be found in them. In other words, what can be found in poetry is truth, is beauty, is lucidity, is clarity, is honesty. And those things really are lacking in so many of our lives. And though nobody, a poem isn't going to fill your belly, but a poem can potentially, if you spend time with it, it can fill your soul. It can let you know what other people see and feel. And it also can make you realize you're not alone. Other people have struggled. Other people have gone through really, really difficult, painful things. And they've survived. Many of them have survived. And many have not survived. But, there's hope. If you have a working brain, if you're alive, if you can somehow cultivate your own voice and your own sense that you matter, that your story matters, that your voice matters, then that can be the difference between life and death.
That's wonderful.
And and I really think it's that important.
So this is a beautiful comment here. I just have two more questions to be mindful of your time here, but if we could talk about the technical aspect of Walk the Dark, could you share some of the things that you were trying to figure out technically after 7 books? You've written several books. You're quite prolific there. As you're getting to Walk the Dark, what were some technical things that you were trying to parse through or overcome as a writer as you were tackling this particular novel?
Well, for me, it's always a little bit of a mystery. When I start a book, I don't know exactly what I'm going to be doing. I have a very rough idea. Like when I started Walk the Dark, I knew I wanted to write about my prison experience. And I knew I wanted to write something from the point of view of somebody who's a prisoner, somebody who's in there. Because I not only spent a fair amount of time with these guys, I was always really curious about what their days were like. And so I was interested in exploring that. But I also needed something in the present of the novel that would be, it's like, what's at stake here for the character? What do they need to get or lose or stand to get or lose? And so for me, it was a way I had to figure out, how do I manage both the present of the novel as this guy is in his last days in the prison, and how do I work that into the sense of where he was when he was 5 years old or 7 years old or 10 years old, and what was his relationship with his mother, and did any one particular thing make him end up committing a murder? And in a way it wasn't, but I needed to figure out how I could incorporate both those threads. And for me, it's often like A novel is this ball of or this thread that's going through a thicket of foliage, say, and I need to, find my way through the thickets of branches and leaves, and I don't know exactly where I'm going. But if I hold on to this thread and follow it where it wants to go and be attuned to that at the same time, I can usually find my way in and through all the unknowns. It's just that I once I figured out, okay, I need to do this guy in flashbacks in the past, looking back at his childhood and things that happened to him. And if I can also have him moving forward toward his last days in the prison, and if I can somehow weave those together, I should be okay. And that's sort of about all I know. And after that, it's just this blind faith that if I'm honest with myself and with the material I'm working with, I can usually find a way through. It's not always easy, and I lose my way, and I can get really lost sometimes in my narrative. But as long as I have a thread that I can hold on to, and it's a very slender thread, but if I can hold on to that and be aware of it at all times, then most of the time I'll be okay.
Oh, that's beautiful. Now, one more question here for you, and I'm sort of intrigued by this, but also believe that it's a big concern because, as I mentioned earlier, we as a society have a tendency to sweep folks and entire communities under the rug. And so I'm curious what you would say to somebody who is more interested in turning a blind eye to the underserved communities, the communities that are suffering right now, whether it's in larger cities or perhaps the folks who are less fortunate, who rarely get any visibility. What would you say to somebody to consider reading this type of work and experience a new perspective?
Well, there's the old saw that, a liberal is a conservative who's been arrested, and a conservative is a liberal who's been mugged. And so much of it depends on your experience. But I think we really lose so much by compartmentalizing people, by not going out and engaging with people who come from different places. And I would really encourage people, go work in a food kitchen, go volunteer at an old folks home, go read to the blind, go do something that's counterintuitive. And I think once you meet people who are from very different backgrounds from you, you may be surprised. You probably will be surprised. And it's an act of empathy, of radical empathy, of saying, okay, what do we share? We're human. We're both human beings, and yet we seem to come from different planets. And how do you throw bridges or even threads across these chasms of, name calling and rancor and hatred? There's just so much of that. And it's I would really encourage people. I think reading books is an act of empathy. It's you're looking through somebody else's eyes at the world. And I would take it a step beyond that. Is go make a point of finding people who are different than you, who come from different places or have different kinds of names or just are from radically different places. And it's so enriching to come across other people and to be continually surprised by who these people are, what they're like, that they're so much like me in so many ways. Both when I was, teaching at an Ivy League university and when I was teaching at a maximum security prison, it's surprising how undifferent these people are in so many ways. I mean, they have much more in common than one would think. And I really find that just being able to step outside your own comfort zone and try to engage in whatever way you possibly can. And just, putting yourself out there and sort of reaching out and seeing what and how people respond. And for me, it's a question of I'm continually surprised by people. I meet someone and I think, oh, they're going to be like this or that or that. And I never get it right. I'm always wrong. And that's part of the delight of it, that to be surprised and see how incredibly rich and varied human experience is. And finally, I think that's why I write. And that's why I hope people will read. Just so we can know somebody else's pain or somebody else's hope or fear or joy. And those are the things I think that enlarge our souls. They make us deeper, better human beings. And I think finally that's maybe the major reason why I write.
Oh, that's a beautiful, humane note to end on. So, Paul, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me, for this brilliant work that you're putting out into the world, and for serving, which is something that we could all try to do a little bit more in our lives and try to make our communities better. So I just want to say thank you. It's been a real pleasure, and I do hope that we get to chat again. And I want to congratulate you on the work.
I want to thank you. You just sort of, I don't know, ask me a question and off I go, and you're really, really good at that. It's a lot harder to do that than people realize, because I've been on the other end interviewing people, and you're good. You're really
I appreciate it. I just got to set you up. I gotta do the layup, right?
Yeah, well, yeah. But no, thank you so much. It's really been a pleasure. It's been a great pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much, Paul. I'll go ahead and wrap up the recording here, but stick around so I can chat a little bit more to wrap up. So thank you all so much for listening, and we'll talk to you real soon.